So I'm gonna start by taping an edge because I wanna do a solid, but another technique that I have is taping an edge. So I'm gonna do them at the same time. And I'm just gonna use our regular tape that we have in the drawer up front. And you can set up your tile however you want. You don't have to like tape it off exactly how I do it, but what I would recommend is make sure you're working in small enough areas that you're actually gonna get all your techniques done. And then I'm gonna work with my blue first. I'm shaking it up first. I was trusting that this was closed. I would double check just since we're sharing these with everyone. Let me get my blue in here. And then I've got my brush. And all I'm gonna do, this is very easy. All I'm gonna do is get 3 coats on. So I've got my first one on. As it dries, it's gonna get kind of chalky, just the way that our high fire glaze did. Once that dries, then I can work on getting another layer on, and then I can build this up with 3 layers, just like we did for the high fire. The only drawback, if you don't get your full 3 layers, on the high fire ones, there were some people on their testers where they're like, this is supposed to be blue, and it turned out brown. That's what happens with high fire, since it's a chemical reaction. With underglaze, if I don't do my full 3 layers, it might just be kind of see-through. It really is like paint. So I've got 2 layers on here right now. They're not fully dry, but I don't want to make you guys sit and wait. You are going to see the texture of your brush strokes. So I'm trying to go over this really lightly so I don't have any like big globs left, because since it doesn't have glass in it, it is gonna flow. Or it isn't gonna flow, it's gonna stay where you put it and show that texture. And then if I pull my tape off now, I've got this clean edge. It bled out a little, but the nice thing about underglaze is since it's not a chemical reaction, it's not gonna have a weird combination if I cover it with my purple. It's just going to cover it. I just did my solid and my tape. I'm still gonna use tape just so I can get a clean edge, but now I'm gonna do my watercolor. So to start, I'm gonna get my colors. Let me move them into the frame a bit more so you guys can see them better. There we go. And what I'm gonna do is I've got 2 colors. Ideally, you want these colors to be able to blend into each other, so having colors that are analogous or next to each other on the color wheel are gonna be your best bet. I'm gonna put my bluish water from cleaning my brush in one, and that's actually already ready to go. If I wanted more color, what I can do is just get a little bit more of my underglaze, add it in there, and then the more water I have, the more see-through it's gonna be, the more glaze I have, the more solid it's gonna be. There's not necessarily a rule of thumb with this, it's really whatever you want visually, and then you can alter it. And then I'm gonna get some purple in my other compartment. Add my water, and then I'm good. So I'm just gonna paint this on, and when it's on a tile flat, it's not as exciting, but if you want, we can even add these colors when you water them down this much we can add them to a spray bottle, and when you're building on something that's vertical, you get these cool drip marks. I'll see if I can kind of manufacture that just by holding it. So I'm gonna hold it here. Let me see if I can get it in the camera a little bit more. And I'm just gonna run my brush, and you can see how I'm already getting this color drip. If I wanted to, I could pause and let that dry, and then I could kind of keep these drips in place. I'm just gonna paint mine on flat, but half of the fun of watercolor is dripping it. So you can see how I still have those drips showing up. The nice thing about watercolor is you can really layer it on, and if you wanna get rid of that, work some more water into it, and you can start to scrub it away a bit. And then the more you layer, you're gonna get each layer of color showing up. My favorite part of watercolor is working, what we call it in watercolor painting is wet on wet. So I've got a layer of moisture right on top, and then I'm gonna put some of another color on that, and because it's already wet and slippery, my second color of the purple wants to kind of move around, wants to flow and drip. So then I can combine colors and I can get them a little bit more mixing and flowy. So I taped my edge. You don't have to. I just like to keep my sections clean, and you can kind of see my color bled through, but same as with the other taped edge, we can just cover that up when we're doing that area for the next technique. So I'm going to check off watercolor, and then I only have a few more. All right, so I'm going to try the ombre now, and this one can be a little bit trickier, but this is where you definitely want colors that are going to blend into each other. So if you're not sure, I have blue and purple. These are next to each other on the color wheel. That means they're going to blend in to each other really well. If I did colors that are not next to each other on the color wheel, what I might end up with is getting like a murky brown. So if you want to double check, you can look at a color wheel on Google, and then that way you make sure that your colors are going to work together. I've got a fan brush here. This is my favorite kind of brush to use when I'm doing ombres, and I'll show you why. And I've mixed half and half of my two colors in my palette. So I've got, hopefully, an in-between between my two colors. I'm going to start with my lighter color. So in this case, that's my purple. And I'm just going to get that kind of halfway on my brush. It's a little bit all the way over, but I have more of it on this half. My ombre is going to fade from purple up here down to blue here. So I'm going to start with the purple. You can see that I taped over my dried glaze here, and I'm just going to cover up this little edge. If I were using something as light as a white or a yellow, then I would want to wipe that off first because that would show through. This is dark enough that it's going to cover up the blue that I have. So I'm going to get my purple on, and ideally I want to work kind of quick with this because it works a little bit better when it's all drying. So I've got my purple on here. I'm not going to clean my brush. I'm just going to dip this half now that has less purple into my half and half mix. So now I've got that half and half transitional color, and because it's all drying, it should start to kind of blend out, but this isn't blending out as quickly as I would like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean my brush real quick, and I'm going to get more purple on it because that blue is just kind of potent. So while it's all still wet, I'll put more purple on, and then I'll go back down. And because of the way I'm moving my brush, if I do see marks, it's gonna be the order of my ombre, or the direction of it, I should say. And this looks pretty good to me now. So now I'm gonna do the bottom half. Now the bummer about ombre, I guess it's a good thing and a bad thing, is you have to layer it 3 times still to get a solid layer where you're not gonna have that see-through effect. So if I don't get it perfect on the first try, this is the nice part, is that I can go back and get some blue on my brush, and I can layer it up again and fix it. So now I've got my blue on half and my middle color on half. I'm gonna go through, my blue's a little bit more watery. I'm doing the half and half brush again, dragging my blue up. And this looks good to me, but now this area where I patched the middle color looks a little wonky. So I do this 3 times. If you don't layer it on top of each other perfectly, like if your ombre happens in a millimeter off space-wise, it's really not a big deal. But what you want to do is make sure you layer it enough, because if you don't have 3 coats, what you will run into, oh, I got a little chunk there, is that you're going to see through your ombre. You'll see your brush strokes. So I'm getting half and half again. So you can use any brush with this. I just like the fan brush because it's so wide that I can do this half and half effect. And then I've got that. I have a little streak of that darker purple up there. I'm honestly not worried about it. I like seeing the brush strokes of these. It reminds me that it's handmade. So if it's not working perfectly for you, then that's okay. One other way you can try it if you don't like the brush technique is you can use a sponge. You will get a little more texture from it, but you just want to be consistent. So I'll start from the other end, and I'll start with my blue on my sponge. I'll dab that on, and as I'm moving up into that middle color, I don't clean my sponge, I just pick that color up right on top of my color. Same thing, try to work when it's still all wet on the surface. And this gives you a little bit more of a like spray paint effect. So whether you prefer that or not, then I'm gonna get purple. I like the brush more. I think it's a little bit cleaner. Some people prefer this effect. And this is a little bit easier for people who don't feel like they can handle the brush skills. And then I'm just, whenever I see a color kind of taking over, like right now my blue's taking over my purple, I just get more of the color that I need to come out more, and I go through with that. And sometimes if I lay it down and it's just globbing on, I'll use the clean part of my sponge to kind of blend them together. And that also works pretty well. So you can use either approach for ombre, and at the end, you should have a clean fade from one color to the next. And that is ombre. Let me pull off my tape before I end it. Ooh, nice clean line. And then here I had it taped over the blue, and now I've got a nice clean divide between those two. All right, so I wanted to show you all the wash technique, which is super easy. And what I'm gonna do is I have this section painted purple, and I've got my texture right here. And all that I'm gonna do is I've got my lid of my other color, so I've got my blue. I've got all the moisture squeezed out of my sponge. So I just dipped my sponge into the blue underglaze, and I'm just gonna press it into this area. And I'm gonna do it with a little bit of force, just so I can really get my blue down into all my carvings. And if I wanted to still watch this edge, I would keep my tape on. Since this guy's just a test tile, I'm not as worried about it. So I've got my blue into all my carvings now, and then I'm gonna flip my sponge over and use the clean side of it, and I'm gonna go back through really lightly, and what this does is start to pick up my color on the surface, so then in the carvings it stays. And I'm gonna show you one more way to do it. This is nice because it's not necessarily picking up my purple, but you can see that I still have like a tint of blue on things. It's gonna lighten a little when it dries, but it will still be a little bit of a tint of blue. The alternative to this is, let me show you. If I wanted it really, really clean, my alternative would be to brush this on and then wipe it off. But you're gonna notice that as I wipe this off, and the nice thing is with a wash, you only need one coat because you're really only getting it in those crevices, so it doesn't need to be thick. So you'll notice that I wiped it away, but it wiped away my purple. So if you wanted to do it this way, so you have more control, what I'm gonna suggest is get your base color on. So for me, it would be my purple. Fire it once, put it in the low fire cabinet, fire it, and then the next day, if this is fired on, you can wipe this purple as much as you need and nothing's gonna come off. If you're in a rush and you're in the situation that I was just in, then what I would recommend is sponging instead, so that way you don't have to worry about messing up your background. Now, if I'm trying to fix this, because like that's gonna bug me, what I can do is take a little bit of my purple back on my sponge and then really lightly kind of sponge this back on. But if I push it too hard, I'm gonna go into my carvings. So I would recommend just firing it multiple times. That's gonna be your most control and your cleanest option. But if you're in a time pinch, you've got both options. And that is called doing a wash, but sometimes I'll call it wipe away too. It's pretty simple. Show you all stenciling, and this is pretty easy, and we've got a ton of different stencils. There's one thing you need to pay attention to when you're doing this, and it's just the moisture of what your glaze is. So I'm gonna work on top of a background color, because if I were to do this and I wanted a background color, if I did the stencil first, it'd be a pain in the butt because I'm painting around all my stencils. So I have this blue, it hasn't been fired on. If you wanted to be extra careful, you could fire on the blue first, and that way if you mess up your stencil, you can just wipe it off. If I mess up my stencil now and I have to wipe it off, I have to redo my blue. So I'm gonna pick one of these flowers, but we've got a ton of different shapes. Let's say that I want to specifically only use one flower. What you can do is tape over the ones that you don't want surrounding, and that way your glaze isn't gonna go through it and you don't have to be quite as careful. And then if I just want this one, I have that. You could also fill a whole area and create a pattern with this. So very similar to the wash, I'm rinsing out my sponge and I'm squeezing out all the water that I can from it. So this right now doesn't have any water dripping out of it. It's as little water as I can manage to have in the sponge. And then I'm gonna pick up a little bit of my second color. So I'm picking up my purple. This is kind of globbed up on the sponge right now, so I like to almost fold it on itself to really get that glaze soaked into the sponge so it's barely on there. And then I'm just gonna tap this through my stencil. If you have too much glaze or if your sponge is really wet, everything's really runny, and then your image is going to just flow out beyond your stencil. Keeping it dry is going to give you a better image. So I'm going to show you what not to do by having way too much and how to avoid that. So I didn't soak my glaze into my sponge now. It's really globby. And then if I try to do it down here, it's going to run out a bit more because it's more liquidy. So if you see this happen, it's because you had too much glaze or too much water in your sponge. So drier is better. And then if you want to make sure that this is very, very solid and not going to be see-through, you could just keep your stencil lined up and then do it 3 times to get your 3 layers. But stenciling, pretty simple. And that's it. Final top technique is to do hand painting, and I know not everyone is crazy comfortable with this, so I'm going to give you a couple options. Remember too that you don't need to have every single technique on your project, you just need to pick 3. So let's say I was like, okay, I did not like stenciling, I did not like the ombre, but I feel like taping went well, solid was easy, and I liked the wash. I can just use wash solid tape in my project and then I'm good to go. You don't have to use all of these. If you want to use more than 3, you can. But I've got my background color here, and then if I am hand painting, what I usually like to do is try to fire this background color on by putting my piece in the low fire cabinet, and then I can map things out, and if I mess it up, I can wipe it off without wiping off my background color. So if I was doing, let's say, like I'm just going to do a flower, if I felt comfortable enough, I could draw it on here. The nice thing about pencil is that it's going to burn off in the kiln firing. So I can map things out, and even if I were to leave this and not glaze it at all, it won't be there when it's done firing. And then if I wanted to do my flower glazing, I could just go through and I could start to glaze on top of this. Let's say I did this on a white background or even just a lighter color underglaze, I could combine some of my other techniques. Like I could watercolor with my glaze on this and make it kind of transparent, and then I could add details like these little like centers of the flower where it's folding, all of those aspects. And then when you are doing this, I know not everyone is comfortable hand painting, so you've got other options too. I'm not going to finish that guy. I'll just set him to the side. What you can also do, so let's say you don't want to hand draw like this. What you could also do is you can print an image and do what's called a graphite transfer. You all probably did this in Art 1, and all that I did is I printed this, and then on the back, underneath that printout, I built up a bunch of pencil lead. So I just scribbled on it and built up graphite. Now what I can do is I can hold this guy on, I can go over it. So if you wanted to, you could even tape it in place to make sure that you're getting this all set up, and you can kind of lift it and check. And I'm going to go over all my lines and try to So I finished going over all my lines. You probably can't see this very well, but this, let me lift it up, has a very, very faint ghost image from the graphite being on the back that I've transferred over. So you can kind of see it. So when I do this, now I can go back over this, got myself a tiny little brush, and if I wanted to, I could do the same thing as I was just doing with that flower. I could just hand paint this all on, and that way I didn't have to hand draw it. The other option is if you don't want to use a paintbrush, if you feel like that's not as good of control, I have these little squeeze bottles, and these are all just different underglazes. So we can funnel in any glaze color that you want in here. These tend to dry out and get clogged, so the cap has a needle in it that keeps that tube clear of getting clogged up with dried glaze. What I will say is test the pressure with this on your paper towel, because some of them come out really runny, some of them come out really slow, so it's good to kind of get a feel for it before you jump in. And then if I wanted to, I find that the brush is easier for me to control, but some people prefer these. A little lumpy over here. I like the brush better. I think it gives me better control. But with that, it gives you a really thin line without having to have really good brush control. So when you're doing this, it's such a small area that I only have to do one layer. If I was doing hand painting, same thing. If it's a really narrow area, chances are we're not going to see through it if you have such a small coverage. But if I was hand painting something that needed to be like even just the center of this flower, I would want to make sure I get my 3 coats on, because otherwise when I put clear on top at the end, I'm going to see this transparent. So I'm going to see some of the purple coming through, or my brush strokes. So with the smaller areas, you can get away with less coats. To be honest, I usually just do the one with the small lines, and then I had mentioned having the background color fired. I think she looks kind of wonky. If I were keeping this, I would wipe her off and redo it. And since my purple isn't fired yet, I would have to patch my purple if I do that. So that's the benefit of multiple firings, but you can do it all in one. You just have to be strategic and a little bit more cautious. And that is the final technique.